Now, for more on the threat posed by the Fabian Society, I'm joined by researcher, former Treasury official, now political researcher, Robert Graziani. Robert, thanks for your time tonight. I've outlined some of the history of the Fabian Society, but are there contemporary members within the Parliament today who are part of this organisation?
Yes, there are, Cory, and thanks for having me. There's Bill Shorten, Tanya Plibersek, Chris Bowen, Stephen Jones, Jenny McAllister, and there's several others, also Andrew Lee, and I think about 10 plus Bill Shorten at the moment. So it's very relevant in today's Labor Party and left of politics in Australia today.
Yeah, that's interesting because it seems to cross the political factional divide within the Labor Party, but it has been put to me that the Fabian Society is no longer as relevant or as influential as it once was. But going through history of the society, they've had great success in establishing other bodies, and those bodies seem to have picked up the primacy of it. What can you tell us about that?
Well, in a way, they're the water carriers and the messengers, if you like, for overseas bodies that actually generate a lot of international socialist thought and policy development. And they are fantastic contacts, if you like, in Australia, but also they have their equivalents in other Western world countries overseas, and they use their audiences and influence in order to promulgate further socialist policies in those countries.
Well, I mentioned a couple of them, Robert. I mentioned the London School of Economics, which had a Fabian-led foundation, or a Fabian Influence Foundation, the New Statesman magazine. I didn't mention, but I will, the League of Nations, of course, which was established with the imprimatur of the Fabians, which morphed into the United Nations effectively. Is that correct?
That is indeed correct. They actually first started off in 1884. They basically were instrumental in creating the British Labor Party and the Australian Labor Party, as well as the New Zealand Labor Party, all around the turn of the century, or just before, of the 19th century to 20th. And then after the First World War, when the seat of socialism in Russia failed to sweep Central and Western Europe, they sort of branched off into a cultural Marxist ideology, whereby they found out that they would need to weaken the society in order for the Marxist expectation to be able to sweep it. So they had to honeycomb basically the culture. And the key pillars of such societies and culture is basically individual sovereignty, family, nuclear family, and national sovereignty, and also the public institutions and the education institutions.
So when you say use the term honeycomb, I presume you mean it's like having a bunch of termites eat away at your foundation and weaken it to such an extent that it collapses. But am I correct in what you've told me, that there's actually a two-pronged attack? You've got the cultural attacks by the Gramsci, the historical thing to undermine these cultural institutions, but you've also got these establishment institutions, if I could use the United Nations as one example, which have their roots in, or their history in the Fabian Society and in socialist agenda, and that's giving them an appeal to authority as well as the undermining of some of the institutions that have cherished the West. Is that a reasonable summation of what we're dealing with?
Indeed, they've covered the top down and the bottom up. So the bottom up is basically the white handing, or the honeycombing, or pitting, if you like, weathering. If you think about rocks and what frost, etc., does over time, just to weaken the resolve and to brush aside the stalwarts and their leadership nature, if you like, in their very local level, whether it be in their family or community sort of thing, or even workplace, And then the top-down messaging, which basically they invite a whole lot of politicians and bureaucrats from fairly esteemed agencies and probably up-and-comers in those agencies to these conferences where effectively they workshop and network, and they develop, or at least they get their 10 commandments and policy talking points, and they take them back into those institutions and then spread them widely and quite vigorously.
Well, an example of this, I think, I'm sick of being lectured by politicians who cite the United Nations or cite what happens at Davos, the cabal of the global elites, which I dealt with last week, where they come back and they say, this is what the experts have to tell us. But the experts are really as compromised as anyone else. They're interested in protecting their own power base. And now we're kind of becoming aware that there is a global agenda of a new form of socialism, if there is a new form of socialism, that's emanating, and it comes back under this Build Back Better mantra, which we're hearing repeated ad nauseum by global leaders.
Yes, Build Back Better seems to be just a further socialising of all activity, economic and as well as social activity in a society, and having it under a tighter and tighter control from a certain elite. It makes it very tough in a way. They've got all their messengers that they come back and flood the zone with. They've got them in media, they've got them in education and academia, as well as they've obviously got a lot of plants inside, or at least willing messengers inside our parliaments, such that when they all get together, they actually flood the zone with this very consistent message, and they also then go and hound those that are obstinate enough to try to stand up against the message. And you see a very prominent example in the last week or so in Australian politics where a member of parliament is pretty well getting told to shut up and be quiet because we don't want to hear that sort of stuff from our very own parliamentarian.
I presume you're talking about Craig Kelly there, who is an excellent representative and a fearless voice against the elites enslaving us in many, many directions, because he's awake to it, and clearly you're awake to it, Robert, but the agenda of the Fabian Socialists was always to advance their cause incrementally until it was too late. The people wake up and then they can't do anything about it. Are we close to that point now?
We're getting there now. This is towards the end stages sort of thing. They've got pretty well all the institutions. They've got totally consistent, dominant message. They're censoring left, right and centre, those that actually stand up against certain messages, or even criticise how messages almost flip from one position to an almost counter-opposite position in just a matter of a few months. And in a way, we're losing the ability to actually fight back against this sort of stuff and keep our own individual and national sovereignty.
Well, Robert Graziani, thank you very much. We haven't given up fighting back here at Sky News. We will inform fearlessly the people of Australia about the issues they need to know about. Thanks very much for your time tonight.